Thank you all for coming. I am Shikha Dalmia, president of the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, or ISMA. It is a great honor to have you all here for ISMA's second annual Liberalism for the 21st Century conference. ISMA is the publisher of Unpopulist, a free Substack you should all subscribe to if you already don't. Both are devoted to defending liberal democracy from the neo-authoritarianism, bigotry, and intolerance on the march in the world today. Like last year, we have folks here from all over the world: Nepal, Bosnia, Israel, England, Mexico, Latin America, and beyond, despite the growing fear of traveling to the United States. Your efforts reflect both a deep concern for liberal democracy's fate and an equally deep commitment to defend it. So thank you. I'd also like to thank our wonderfully diverse and courageous sponsors. Hewlett Foundation's generous general support has helped keep the lights on at ISMA. The Packard Foundation has been extraordinarily generous. I'm also deeply grateful to Stand Together Trust and the Institute for Humane Studies for their support. The New Pluralists and Johns Hopkins at Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins have also pitched in to make today possible. And a special nod to our media partners, Vox and Persuasion, for not only helping us reach some of the speakers you'll be hearing from over the next 2 days, but also for spreading the word far and wide, along with our many other partners, especially Project Liberal. It is fitting that we have gathered at this venue. If we are discussing the abuse of political power, what better place than the scene of the biggest political crime, at least until January 6th. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough meme coins to book the Capitol building. This venue is a reminder of how far we are from the halcyon days when a single scandal could bring down a corrupt regime. The forces of authoritarianism are stronger now than when we convened last year. Poland's Law and Justice Party has rebounded. Modi's Hindu nationalist BJP has regained ground. Marine Le Pen's national rally has surged. And Netanyahu's unpopular right-wing government has doubled down in Gaza, even as starvation sets in. Remarkably, the one country holding its leaders accountable is Ukraine, and that too while battling the Putin Goliath. But the big story then, as now, is America. Last July, when we all met, Bill Kristol joked that we might be hosting this event at Guantanamo Bay. Trump has dispatched the National Guard to DC, and who knows, any minute now, it could barge in and haul us all away, turning Bill's quip into a prophecy. Should that happen, you should all be aware that although Guantanamo's Yelp rating is not so good, it does have a really nice spa with a bracing waterboarding option. At the time Bill made this remark, few thought Trump would win the popular vote, gain unified control of Congress, and hold a Supreme Court majority. If you've traveled abroad, you know how large America looms in every conversation, partly because its elephantine economic footprint can flatten economies and destroy lives with its abrupt aid cuts and tariff resets, and partly from global curiosity and anxiety over what follows if the American experiment collapses. The beauty of this 249-year-old experiment is that it delivered living standards unprecedented in history, not by sacrificing moral progress, but making it central to America's success. America rejected the old world's zero-sum economic model of territorial conquest, mercantilism, colonialism, and replaced it with one that was based on open commerce and mutual benefit. Slavery is this country's original sin, and much work remains for true racial justice. Still, America's success came from flattening hierarchies, ending exploitation, harnessing human potential, and offering opportunity regardless of caste, creed, religion, or color. America's genius is not that it draws the best people, but it draws the best out of people. Even the world's wretched manage to make themselves something here. But we are getting a first-hand taste of what happens when liberal democracy starts to collapse. A liberal democracy aspires to impartial justice. Trump has exploited his power to reward loyalists, even violent ones, and retaliate against his expanding list of enemies, including universities, prosecutors, judges, law firms, media companies, and opposition leaders. A liberal democracy holds corrupt rulers accountable. Trump has fired watchdogs without cause. A liberal democracy keeps civil society out of the clutches of the state. Trump's anti-DEI crackdown aims to scare these groups into silence. Above all, a liberal democracy affirms the equal dignity of every person and builds institutions, especially a just rule of law, to protect it. That commitment means, first and foremost, forbidding rulers from dividing the public into favored and unfavored groups, and then denying the latter the guarantees of due process. Yet, in the last few months, masked ICE agents have smashed car windows and abducted people. Immigration and law enforcement is being militarized. The Marines were hardly out of Los Angeles when the National Guard arrived in DC. The Alien Enemies Act is being used to send many innocents to Salvadoran gulag. Foreign students have been detained for months for writing op-eds or protesting. Other immigrants are simply being vanished in the detention system, the Wall Street Journal reports. Foreign tourists have faced harsh interrogation and invasive phone and computer searches just to enter the country. Family separation is back in vogue. A friend of mine, Riley, joked recently, Hungary is not looking so bad these days. Authoritarian consolidation is Trump's true Operation Warp Speed. After 250 years as a constitutional republic, America has stunningly shown that it has no exceptional immunity to the authoritarian vices. Like everywhere else, all it has is us liberals. So we have our work cut out for us. Trump has pulled out of the history of the dustbin of history, the patrimonial system, as Jonathan Rauch has written. In this system, rulers treat the state as their personal property and citizens as their personal serfs. The result always and everywhere is incompetence, rank corruption, and repression. Honest people get fired and the worst rise to the top. Witness Trump's rogue cabinet. A World Bank study 2 decades ago found that America's strong institutions, its courts, property rights, and effective government accounted for about 418,000 of its 735,000 per capita wealth. Under Putin's patrimonialism, the average Russian builds $73,000 of wealth over his lifetime, despite the country's vast oil resources. Russia's corrupt institutions siphon out more than they put in people's pockets, it seems. Ditto in socialist, nepotistic India I grew up in. That is America's future if we don't stop the trashing of our institutions. Of course, there are post-liberal contenders besides patrimony vying to replace the liberal order. Viktor Orban is the neo-right's chief hero with his promise to purge wokeness and reviving Western civ. Yoram Hazony, the architect of the national conservative movement, seeks to replace liberalism with an ethno-religious nation-state. Catholic integralists want to fuse religion and state and establish a national faith that rules civic life. And hyper-individualistic and futuristic tech pros, ironically, want to resurrect past collective group hierarchies around race and gender in the name of merit. Make no mistake, together they will restore religious persecution along with every form of bigotry. Nativism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, no matter how much they package their ideas in gauzy utopias. We have an entire panel tomorrow to parse these post-liberal alternatives, so I won't dwell on them, except to say this. Expect each of these systems to end up riddled with exactly the same patrimonial corruption that we are seeing from Trump. Why? Because realizing this vision requires handing unchecked power to ideologues while sidelining good governance, equal protection of the law, and citizens' rights. These facts give us liberals a huge political opportunity. But to capture it, we need to fashion a broad counter-movement to replace the left-right divide with a new illiberal one, as I tell anyone who is willing to listen to me. That means opposing bigotry and uniting around core liberal values: tolerance, pluralism, equal protection, and accountable rulers. To some extent, the realignment is already underway, in the US at least. Look around you, and you'll see in this room devoted Democrats, skeptical Democrats, independents, libertarians, recovering libertarians, former Republicans, anguished and heartbroken conservatives. Practically everyone except the MAGA right and the extreme left. There is a self-sorting mechanism here. But let's not kid ourselves. Solidifying a new alignment won't be easy. Why? Because it's easier to know who our enemies are than who our friends are. That's one big reason there aren't that many examples in the world of successful resistance movements yet, a topic we'll consider tomorrow. Building a liberal coalition requires former political foes to learn to trust one another and negotiate their inevitable moral disagreements. We'll have to overlook what we regard as each other's past transgressions. We'll have to live with disagreements over whether non-right-wing threats to liberalism are worth addressing or mere distractions. We'll have to thrash out differences over how much to concede to our opponents to secure electoral victories. That seems like a strategic issue, but often strategic disagreements stem from different levels of commitments to competing moral values. As in any workable marriage, we can't paper over these differences, but we can't let them turn into separate Netflix accounts either. But one thing we must bear in mind is that although moral clarity will help our effort, insisting on moral purity would be self-defeating. My inspiration as I grapple with these issues is Frederick Douglass, specifically the oration he delivered at Lincoln Park to commemorate a statue of Lincoln commissioned by emancipated slaves on the 11th anniversary of our 16th president's assassination. I live right next to the park in the middle of the swamp, and every day I walk by the larger-than-life 12-foot bronze figure with Cherry, my beagle mix. What is striking about this speech, Douglass's speech, given the occasion, is its utter honesty. It is no Lincoln hagiography. To the contrary, Douglass is shockingly scathing, as if he wanted to make sure that history did not paper over Lincoln's faults. Reversing a previous statement, he dubbed Lincoln the white man's president who was entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He pointed out that Jefferson had said that 1 hour of slavery was worse than ages of oppression that American revolutionaries had endured at the hands of British colonialists. He noted Lincoln seemed to love the Union more than he hated slavery. He rattled off a litany of Lincoln's troubling views, including his desire to resettle blacks to Africa, his belief that if he could save the Union without abolishing slavery, he would, and his refusal to let blacks in the army, at least initially. Despite all this, Douglass also admired and trusted Lincoln. The hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln, he praised. There was no man better fitted for this mission of emancipation than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's name was near and dear to our hearts in the darkest and the most perilous hours of the Republic, he said. He defended Lincoln against slams by his radical abolitionist brothers like William Lloyd Garrison, who never gave Lincoln for his alleged slowness. What did Douglass see in Lincoln? For starters, Douglass was too clear-headed to confuse radicalness for commitment or prudence for lack of principles. Unlike more weak-kneed slavery opponents, he could see there were basic moral lines Lincoln held deeply in his heart. For example, his fondness for the Union did not cause him to minimize the heinousness of slavery. His depictions of its evil were unflinching, nor did he ever concede an iota to the notion that the South's economic dependence on slavery was any reason for caution. The dependence wasn't mitigating, it was implicating. As Douglass reminded his audience, Lincoln, for all his determination to keep the Union intact, hinted in the second inaugural that the Civil War was divine retribution for slavery when he said that, if God wills that the war continues, it was because he wanted the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. In short, Douglass did not create a checklist of moral principles and expect Lincoln to score full marks on it, nor did he put blind faith in Lincoln. Douglass drew moral boundaries that allowed him to see Lincoln's heart, not build moral silos that prevented him from joining hands with the most effective champion of his cause. In our common struggle against authoritarianism, we should make Douglass our role model. We need to be generous, forgiving, clear-headed, yet committed. So let's join hands together and defeat the bullies and the tyrants and defend a reinvigorated liberalism for the 21st century.